that number of animals and people, 2 million gallons per day. Later they would get it from rock reservoirs. To me, one of the biggest miracles of their providential journey was that their shoes never wore out. I've been in sandals climbing Mount Sinai, and it wrecked the sandals. The sharp stones of the desert of Sinai wreck shoes quickly. And it says their shoes never wore out. Now, you either have to say this is true and God did it, or you have to dismiss it all as legend. There's no in-between stage when you read statements like this. But they also had internal problems. Can you imagine that number of people camping together? I mean, sometimes it's bad enough just taking your family camping when you're all pushed together in the same tent or the same caravan. Can you imagine 2 million people? It's no wonder that one of the biggest problems Moses had was actual disputes between the people. And he had to be a judge. And they all came to Moses with their problems. Like in some large churches, everybody wants to go to the pastor with their problem. That's what was happening. Unfortunately, Moses' father-in-law was a good deal more sensible than Moses, though he was not one of God's people. And he said, you need elders. And Moses appointed 70 elders. Well, let's go back and on with the sections. We're into the second half now. And the first thing that happens in the second half are the 10 Commandments, written with God's finger on the rock, on 2 tablets of stone. Now, every time you see a picture of those 2 tablets of stone, you see the first 4 commandments on one and the next 6 on the other. It wasn't like that at all. 10 were on one and 10 were on the other. Why? Because this was a legal contract. And one copy was God's and one copy was the people's. You understand now why it was 2 tablets of stone? Because that's how it should be done. There should be 2 copies, one for each party. But since it was a covenant as well as a contract, God wrote them both. There was no bargaining went on. God said, now this is how you're to live. And he gave them 3 legal collections. One we call the 10 Commandments, or the Decalogue, which means 10 words. The second we call the Book of the Covenant, which we find in chapters 20 to 23. And then we have another book of laws in chapters 25 to 31 or 32, which are laws of worship. Now, all these make up the law of Moses and more. There are more in Deuteronomy as well. But the law is not just 10 commandments. It's a whole lot more. There are 613 rules and regulations for the way they're to live right before God. But let's start with the 10 commandments. There are 3 basic principles, or 2 that I want to mention. First of all, the principle of respect. All the 10 commandments are based on that principle. Respect for God, respect for his name, respect for his day, and then respect for people, respect for family life, honor your father and mother, respect for life itself, don't murder, respect for marriage, don't commit adultery, respect for people's property, don't steal, respect for people's reputation, don't bear false witness, respect, respect, respect. A healthy, holy society is built on respect. And a nationally known television comedian recently said, we intend to leave nothing sacred. And TV comedy, more than anything else, is destroying respect. Respect for the Queen, respect for authority, respect for the police, respect for the law. We can see in our society what happens when respect disappears. But God's law is based on respect. Loving God and loving your neighbor can be translated respecting God and respecting your neighbor. That's the basic principle behind God's law. It's a law of respect. And loss of respect for God leads you to idolatry. And loss of respect for people leads you into immorality and injustice. So that you can see how the law is made up. It's a good law. Most of the 10 Commandments are about acts and deeds or words. But the last of the 10 is about feelings. It's the only one about the heart. And perhaps that's why Paul once said that he kept all 9, but he couldn't manage the 10th. And the 10th one is, don't be greedy. Don't want what you haven't got. That's the only one concerned with your inner life. The rest are all concerned with behavior. There's a principle about the 10 laws which the Jewish boys and girls learn on their fingers. And the principle is this: if you break one, you've broken them all. Because they belong together like a necklace. And you ladies, doesn't matter where you break a necklace, but if you break it just once, the beads are all lost. And this is a profound principle. They're not 10 separate commandments. They are the law. They're not laws. They're the law. And if you break it at any point, you have broken the law. If a policeman stops me for speeding, it's no use my saying, but I've stopped at every red traffic light this afternoon. So it doesn't matter how many laws you've kept. You've broken the law. And God says this is a whole law. A holistic law, we would say today. You break one, you've broken the lot. It's spoiled. It's in pieces if you break it at any point. Respect, you see, is a whole thing. And you can't have some respect and not others. You either are a respecting person or you're not. And you show you're not when you break one. The second principle is responsibility. And now we are brought up, I'm afraid, on psychology and sociology to believe that people are not responsible for their actions. They're even now trying to say that wickedness is due to a gene. Well, we know that original sin goes down through the genes. But the idea that some people are more wicked than others because they have a wrong gene means they're not responsible for what they do. The law of God says you are accountable, you are responsible, you have chosen to break this. And it holds us responsible before God, every one of us, to live right before God. So the two principles of respect and responsibility are written in. And therefore, a third principle is also written in, the principle of retribution. There are sanctions in this law. One of them is capital punishment. The death penalty is applied to 18 different sins against God in the law of Moses. Aren't you glad you don't live under the law of Moses? Because breaking the Sabbath, death penalty. There is retribution here. There is punishment. And I notice particularly there's a very careful distinction in God's law between intentional and accidental breaking. There are two sorts of killing. There's intentional murder and there's accidental manslaughter. But in every case it says there is no sacrifice in the Mosaic law for continued, deliberate, intentional sin. And there isn't in the New Testament either. You read the letter to the Hebrews. Well, now this law is given in a context, and the context is this. I brought you out of Egypt. I'm going to bring you into Canaan. This is how you're to live now. Now that's an important point. It's on the basis of what God has done for them and what He will do for them that He appeals to them to live right now. And it's the same in the New Testament, isn't it? It's on the basis of what God has done for you and what He's going to do for you that He says, now this is how I want you to live now. Without that context, the law becomes a harsh, impersonal, horrid thing. But in that context, it's a good thing. It fits. It's the response of gratitude to God's grace. Then we come to the fact that God wants to live with them. He gave the 10 Commandments at the top of Mount Sinai. Oh, let's look at Mount Sinai, perhaps. It's a fearsome mountain, and there's another picture on here that you'll know what I'm going to talk about in a moment. Forget this for the minute. There's Mount Sinai. It's an extraordinary mountain. I've climbed up it at 3 o'clock in the morning before the sun came up. I found a little girl at the top, a little Jewish girl, reading the 10 Commandments in Hebrew. And I said to her, "What's your name?" She said, "Miriam." And I said, "My, you've been here a long time." But anyway, St. Catherine's Monastery is at the foot of it. But I always wondered, when it said in the Bible, "Don't touch my holy mountain." I thought, how can you touch a mountain? It's ridiculous. Until I saw this picture. You can actually walk up to the mountain and touch it, because it rises sheer from the desert floor. Can you see that? It's like a cliff. And they had to put a fence around it, because God wanted them to realize He was a holy God.